Come with me. I'll take you somewhere safe.
This isn't the time to run. I'm not like you. Running will just make me look guilty.
You think this was an accident, Kate? There are no accidents in this city.
You don't want to know what's behind your face, just keep running.
I've already mentioned Mirror's Edge in 2 other videos I've done. The first after the fact I ever did, and more recently when I talk about moving in games. But I don't think I've done a good enough job of fully articulating why Mirror's Edge is my favorite game, despite all of its flaws. First, I should say that I'm far more interested in media, specifically games, that have amazing concepts or ideas, but may have some flaws rather than a game with mechanics and ideas that work well, but I've seen multiple times before. That's the short form way of explaining my fascination with something like Mirror's Edge, while I couldn't care less about another Grand Theft Auto game. So with that being said, what about Mirror's Edge is just so damn cool that I think about it more than everything else that's come out before and after its release? The first and biggest reason, obviously, is the movement. How a game lets you move through its world is always something that fascinates me, because it's a commonality between so many games and genres. I mean, there's a stick dedicated to it on every controller. And on that broad commonplace between games, Mirror's Edge stands out from every other game I've played, including its contemporaries in similar genres. Other first-person games have generally 2 speeds, standard and sprinting, which is often activated by some sort of button press. Popular first-person games like Call of Duty and Half-Life only differentiate between the 2 speeds by immediately changing your velocity with no acceleration and instead just add some sort of bobbing to your weapon. And that's just there to give some form of visual representation of the increased effort put into this new motion. There are dozens of other games that utilize this same exact method too. Mirror's Edge has no sprint button, it's all about acceleration, and each increment of that acceleration to your max speed is well represented. First, you'll hear Faith's pace quicken, then she begins breathing more frequently and heavier, her arms swinging in rhythm with her steps. Finally, the edges of the screen blur. Here, your proficiency of movement is rewarded visually, audibly, and in the game itself. When you move faster, it's easier to reach greater heights, clear bigger gaps, get away from enemies, and there's no arbitrary "you're tired, stop running" meter like other games have. You gain all of your speed yourself and get rewarded for it in every aspect of the game, rather than just hitting a button to toggle it on and off. It's still the only non-racing game I think of that handles speed this way. But the movements in Mirror's Edge go beyond just your own speed. It's how the camera reacts to all of your actions. It bobs with each stride, it tumbles with your rolls, it jerks with the sidestep, and it abruptly twists when you turn around. All of your actions have some sort of unique representation from the game's camera. And even when you're just standing still, the camera swells with Faith's breathing. Nothing is ever static in this game. And since all of these camera movements are so different from what we're used to, I really appreciate that the tutorial gives you a good visual reference for what all of these crazy movements you see in first person translate to. The tutorial's kind of boring in a monkey see, monkey do sense, since you just follow Celeste around as she runs about this secluded urban playground, but grounding what your actions look like is really important, especially when they look this bizarre. And this is a pretty solid way to get that message to the player. And I sort of contrasted Mirror's Edge's unique use of a first-person camera to other first-person shooters earlier on, and that may be a little unfair. The Half-Lifes and Call of Duties of the world have a different main focus than Mirror's Edge with their shooting and stuff, and since Mirror's Edge mainly focuses on movement, there's a lot of attention on those little details that make it all the more satisfying. And I really admire when a game can make movement, possibly the most universal mechanic among games, so creative, satisfying, and intimate. That idea of intimacy with your movements is something I originally brought up in my first video of Mirror's Edge. It's creating a connection between the player and the game character through all of these motions because each one of our actions has a unique representation in-game through Faith. All the nuanced camera motions make it feel like playing as a person rather than a camera on a dolly, which those first-person games I mentioned earlier use. Their framing is almost entirely static. As for the other elements of Mirror's Edge, I'd say they're under-realized. So I'll try explaining why I'm so attracted to the potential I see in many of this game's ideas.
You're gonna have to get through.
I've talked about the combat a bit before, but it's one of the most bizarre elements of this game. So I'm going to talk about it again. There are so many different ways to attack in this game. A punch combo, a slide kick, jump kick, crouch punch, wall kick, running jump kick, attack from above, and a disarm move. But there aren't really any opportunities to use all these different moves well. You're barely even given a chance to. Absolutely you'll use them, but maybe just a couple. I can't think of a single moment where the jump kick would be used. You have to slow down and then jump up and kick. There's no situation where that's a better option than just running full speed and kicking someone. And it looks way cooler.
Blue's up ahead. Be careful.
But this leads to an issue that combat causes with the movement. There's no good way to attack an enemy and keep the majority of your momentum. I always think of Faith as this sort of projectile. When interacting with the environment, she'll keep a lot of her momentum as long as she's bouncing off of surfaces and vaulting over rails, but there's no good way to dispose of these guys and keep moving. And moving well is when Mirror's Edge is the most fun. So hand-to-hand combat doesn't have any options for handling this well. What about the guns? Well, yes and no. You can move fairly well with a pistol, but the rest of the guns completely inhibit your speed and range of motion. So there's an interesting idea of a trade-off here. Faster and more vulnerable versus slow with more stopping power. But it's not close to an equivalent trade because running and using all the moves in your little parkour basket is infinitely more rewarding than shooting. Shooting sucks. That in the game rewards you with some sort of congratulations for not using any guns with this way to go message in the objectives menu. Then the mixed message gets even more jumbled when Faith shoots at people in the game's weird looking cutscene. And some of her original concept art is her holding a gun. But she also tauntingly drops a gun in the loading screen too. But there's a way to combine guns and movement and make it fun, and that idea is in Chapter 3. Heat. You use a gun to shoot out the glass so you don't have to stop and kick it to break it, so you can keep your movement going. I feel like there was pressure to put guns in this game, given that almost every other first-person game at the time and now has guns in it. So okay, I'll fold on weapons being part of the game. So do more interesting things with them that complement the best aspect of the game, running. Keep the bad shooting mechanics, don't encourage the player to use it against enemies, use it on the environment. So it's unfortunate that some of the levels have areas designed around this combat, where it's downright unavoidable.
Watch it. Blue's up ahead. Looks like you're gonna have to fight.
I will say I find something charming about the awkward fight with Celeste towards the end of the game, though. I think it's because it's just so different from how combat is used in the rest of Mirror's Edge. It highlights how clunky your moves are, especially in a less mobile environment. But there's something fun about changing how you've been using these moves all of a sudden. It can absolutely be called bad game design, but I prefer to think of it as an interesting change-up. And I think that Icarus troops are a really cool way to make you feel threatened too. For all other parts of the game, movement is how you could outmatch enemies. Now they can almost keep up with you. It's invasive, but a cool change to make you feel more concerned about how well you move through the environment, since they can catch up to you pretty quick.
This training, Merc. This Project Icarus, Pirandello Kruger, they're not here to bolster the police. They're being trained to come after us. After the runners.
But where parts of levels have poor combat design, there's some really interesting design when it comes to traversal. You'll notice faster ways to move through the environment on follow-up playthroughs, and this sort of design is noticeable as early as the first level of the game.
Yeah, I'm sure the birds are real impressed with me. But once you finish showing off, you think you might concentrate on some actual work? Get Celeste in position for a handoff. You need to get the delivery to her. She'll be near the communications tower ahead of you.
So you start with this total stress-free environment that makes you use a lot of the movement mechanics that the tutorial just ran you through. You cushion your falls by rolling, vault or slide under objects, wall running, you get the point. And then on your first run through, before you've exactly learned what sort of falls require a tumble to cushion the landing, you descend out of an air duct, stumble as you impact the ground, and look up to a gathering of police officers. And at this point, the previously ambient and peaceful music is now loud and abrasive. You hear the police shout after her. And your flight instinct kicks in a hell of a lot more than your fighting one, since the game has taught you a lot more about moving and not much on combat. Turn right, there's a staircase. Run up it, they don't catch up to you. Get away nice and safe. But if you're inclined to play through Mirror's Edge again, that original run up the stairs can turn into something far more entertaining.
Just get the hell out of there. Flyers are going crazy. Get out of there.
It's a style of level design that I guess could be compared to some levels of The Last of Us, where there's a definite beginning and end to an area, but there are options as to how you get to the exit. Both Mirror's Edge is not so much branching paths as it is the multiple obstacles that you can interact with in between the beginning and end of a zone. Take the staircase like a normal human being, or skip a few flights of stairs with some wall runs.
Runners see the city in a different way. They see the flow. Rooftops become pathways and conduits, possibilities, and routes to escape. The flow is what keeps us running, keeps us alive.
Much like how the runners in Mirror's Edge's world see the environment differently, players will too after they spend more time with that game. And the runner's vision is a nice way to stylistically convey a good object to interact with. But I prefer playing with it off. I want to see what I can find for myself after so many playthroughs of the game. It just feels more organic to me. And while interacting with different objects in the Nameless City, you'll come across some graffiti that attempts to add some character to the Mirror's Edge universe. And while I think graffiti as a storytelling device has certainly been exhausted at this point, and is arguably not a great storytelling mechanic in the first place, I sort of excuse that with Mirror's Edge because of the theme of artistic suppression in this totalitarian city. And really, from what we're given, those are some of the better bits of storytelling and world building in the whole game. That's not to say it has much competition though. Mirror's Edge opens with a cutscene giving some background on the city, and it sounds really interesting at first when they present it to you.
Once the city used to pulse with energy. Dirty and dangerous, but alive and wonderful. Now, it's something else.
A city that gradually became more peaceful, but at the cost of some natural freedoms. Riots arise against a false democracy, but they don't accomplish what they set out to do. And those who fought and continue to fight are jailed. And then Faith and the other runners pass along information for these people. I wanted that. And then we get that little bitty hint of it in the first mission. But after that, nothing. They teased me with those ideas, and it may just be my brain locking out other games that have a similar premise, but I can't think of anything else quite like it. Similar to a lot of other bits of Mirror's Edge, it's unique. That silly whodunit story we get instead isn't.
It's Robert. Robert Pope, friend of Dad's.
Shit, that Pope.
But the city environment is, and that's what I want more of. Mirror's Edge isn't so uniform to other games, and it's that sort of individuality that can be credited for the game's small following. Faith, while her character remains relatively undeveloped, has turned into somewhat of a mascot for the game. People remember who she is because she stands out, not unlike how she stands out in the game world as well. No one really gives a damn about Jackknife, Celeste, Merc. I mean, I think this guy's name is Krieg, and he's on screen for about 5 seconds. But people know Faith. Not too many games out there have Asian women in them, let alone have them as the main character. So yeah, diversity's pretty cool.
Hey, you want to come with me tomorrow? Could use the help.
Can't. Drake's got me on a job. Says I've been slacking. Look, I've gotta go.
It's fine. Someone's bound to start shooting at me soon. Get going.
But there is a bit of storytelling in the game that is interesting, and it's a little Easter egg tucked away in the last level of the game, the Shard.
I was too young to remember exactly how it started. The authorities said the changes were for the greater good. But good isn't the same as right.
Faith reflects on the events of her past without taking you away from the game itself. I think that's a pretty interesting way to drip feed more information to you about the world. And it's not unlike item descriptions in Dark Souls. I mean, there are some if you look really hard. And I care a lot more about how a story is told in a game rather than the actual content of it. Not to say the content of it isn't important, but storytelling is something games can still experiment with, and AAA games don't do it enough. Frankly, cutscenes aren't an interesting way to tell a story in a game. We're playing a game, so find ways to tell stories through that medium. Dark Souls' item descriptions and placement of those items is a really interesting way to tell a story, and I think Mirror's Edge has some interesting ideas in there too. I would have loved to hear Faith's memories about certain areas of the city, but what's there instead is a lot more traditional and unfortunately not too engaging.
Krieg says Kate's just been tried.
Already?
Wonders of the swift justice.
This program, huh? They found her guilty, Faith.
Of course they did.
But what's even stranger is that they used a lot of this environmental storytelling to tease a silly little Easter egg.
Jesus, the rats are getting big in here.
What's happening? Report! Over!
And it did come out that the majority of what Rihanna Pratchett, the game's writer, wrote was cut because it was implemented too late in the game's development cycle. Pratchett said that they removed all of Faith's level dialogue. I'm curious what Pratchett's full script would have done to the game instead of what we got, where a fair amount of world building can be credited to the scrolling text in a long elevator ride. I will admit that there's some nice ideas in the cutscenes, although I'm not sure why they chose to have the cutscenes look like this. They have arguably the best looking game of last generation, and they went with whatever you want to describe this as. But I do like Celeste talking to Faith about living and surviving.
I'll survive. That's what we do.
Survival is overrated. You need to live a little, too.
And Merc pretending not to listen in on Faith and Jackknife's conversation.
Try not to get yourself killed.
Merc, you can stop pretending not to listen now.
What's up?
Along with a little graffiti post-it notes from the janitor, Mirror's Edge's world has some really interesting use of color. The city is entirely washed of it in an eerie uniformity, while the inner rooms are vibrant. And it's a nice, albeit simple clash of colors between the red runners and the blue police.
Take long to lose them?
Nah, those blues can't move for shit. They've gotten a little gun-happy, though.
And red's such a good color to use too, it's just naturally eye-catching. And I like how the color is part of runner culture instead of just a game mechanic. Dumb. But seeing the exterior of a city look so similar and then the interior of those buildings try to differentiate themselves as much as possible is very reflective of the society of that city. And that's a cool visual representation of that. And something about the level select highlighting your route out of an entirely white city by making all the buildings you'll visit red just makes me feel like I'm taking it all back for myself. Like for this brief period of time, this is my bit of the city.
Hey, bud down. You should be able to get into the mall without being shot at.
And the runner vision color use is a really good way to keep you moving, but a problem that I've said a few times now is that the game isn't nearly as fun when you're not moving. What makes the game fun is moving, so it's not going to be too great when you're not doing that. That's why combat gets in the way so much, because it's so hard to keep moving while fighting. But things like death and just screwing up a jump punish you by taking enjoyment out of the experience. This isn't a problem exclusive to Mirror's Edge, but actually across the medium as a whole. There have to be more creative ways to punish players for screwing up. It's an incredibly complex issue to tackle, and frankly something I'm interested in looking at in the future, so I'll save that talk for then.
You get directions from a base, get out of there. Nice work.
It's just the uniqueness of Mirror's Edge's ideas that make me so attached to it. I love the movement, I love the environment, I love that Faith is different from the city's population and the main characters of other games. And I get mocked and teased a bit because I consider a game so flawed as my favorite, and attaching myself to potential of a game is a bit odd, but I've reached the point where I think it's justified. Would you rather a sequel to a game that already nailed everything it attempted, or a sequel to a really interesting game that had mistakes, which could be resolved in a follow-up? For me, it's the latter, no question. Look at Uncharted 1 to Uncharted 2. They fixed a lot of the problems with the original and made something really fantastic. There, glad it happened. Don't need to make any more because you might screw it up. And now there is a sequel for Mirror's Edge out there. And even though I have my cynical doubts that this sequel will even get released because of the huge gaps in their talking about it, I like what I've seen so far. Faith tossing away the gun, climbing those silly pipes a lot faster, and they even talk about how they want to treat Faith as a projectile too.
They kind of speak about Faith's power and efficiency because she is a projectile. Whenever she does hit, she hits quick, fast, and hard, and then moves on.
I said that earlier. That's what I want. And Faith looks badass as hell with their redesign. So yeah, please make this happen. And my stubbornness has sort of edged off over time regarding aspects of this game too. When at first I was all about guns being the worst, I've sort of accepted now that they can be part of the experience. But it's just how they're used that I want experimented with. And I really want DICE to have another chance to get this one right. There's a lot of uniqueness to Mirror's Edge, and its best moments are unfortunately brief. But brief as they are, they're special enough to keep my brain occupied on them for the past 6 years since I first played this game.